All right. Well, I think I will go ahead and get started with the presentation. Anybody else that jump in whenever they're here. First off, my name is Todd. I represent Old Forester here in Minnesota and Wisconsin. Get to do a lot of fun things like working on all of the single barrel selections with a bunch of other folks. Uh, One of the coolest parts of the job. I also focus on doing staff trainings, making sure people are familiar with Old Forester and know what to recommend and things like that. Um, Basically, how tonight's going to go, I'm going to kind of cover a little history of bourbon, a little history of Old Forester for 10 minutes or so. Then we'll dig into like barrel aging, maturation, the single barrel selection process, things like that. There will be time to ask questions. If something comes up and you don't want to forget till the end, just go ahead and pop it in the chat. Get to it when we get to that point. Feel free to. We'll do some discussion of the actual single barrels at some point, but feel free to start sipping and tasting while we go through stuff. Trust me, it makes me a lot more entertaining. It's just how it goes. So yeah, I will go ahead and get started. And everybody hear me okay? Any problems there? And can you see my
Sounds
screen?
good, Todd. You sound good.
Awesome, thank you. You can see the screen just fine.
Yeah, we see your presentation.
Yep, looks good.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. So a little bit about bourbon. I know we're all whiskey fans, and most of this is probably a little bit of a reminder, but it's kind of fun to look at just how regulated this thing is. So bourbon as we know it today, America's native spirit. Um, since 1964, it has been a law that bourbon must be produced in the United States. Fun little fact is before that, during Prohibition, you can actually still find some bottles of Mexican bourbon where distilleries relocated to Mexico during Prohibition. Some of those are still floating around at auctions and things of that nature. It's a cool little historical piece. I don't recommend purchasing it unless you are a huge history buff, because I'm fairly certain the liquid in there would be disgusting. But hey, you never know. So product of the United States must be aged in a new charred oak container since 1938, when that was made law. It does not specify American oak, as lots of folks tend to think, but it must be new and charred. Aged for 2 years may be labeled straight bourbon. Any bourbon aged less than 4 years must have an age statement on the label. So if you ever get a chance to check out some of the craft distilleries that are putting out, basically new make, calling it bourbon, because like aged for 1,562 microseconds or whatever. Must be distilled to less than 160 proof. Must go into the oak container at 125 proof or less, and be bottled at a minimum of 80 proof. And then as you can see over here, I won't go through all of them, just some kind of cool dates in the history of bourbon. As you know, sure, as we go back further, the actual history gets a little murky of, the first person that called it bourbon, or why it's called bourbon, or the first person that charred a barrel, and things of that nature. There's, 17 different fishing stories of who did what and when. The kind of the coolest thing for me that I didn't know about before I started in this job was that during Prohibition, in 1920, when Prohibition went into effect, there were 6 distilleries that had permits to sell medicinal whiskey. And they were Brown-Forman, Glenmore, Frankfurt Distilleries, American Medicinal Distillers, Shenley, and A. Philip Stitzel. The cool thing about that is they were allowed to sell medicinal whiskey. They were allowed to sell stocks that they had already made, but they were not allowed until like 1929. They were not allowed to make new whiskey. So they couldn't produce anything, but they could sell anything that they had. It was all prescription only because at that point, bourbon, whiskey was your cure for the cold, pneumonia. It was considered a thing that was great for blood pressure and digestion, all kinds of stuff. So you could get it prescribed. Always find a bottle of Old Forester on the shelf. You just might have had to go fake a cough, to get it. Then at the end of Prohibition, we move into when Congress starts requiring the use of charred new oak containers for the aging of bourbon, and then to 64, where bourbon is classified as a distinctive product of the United States, which does include U.S. protectorates such as Guam and Puerto Rico. I'm not aware of any distilleries in Guam. I know there's one in Hawaii, which I think I would really like to get a bottle of Hawaiian bourbon. That would just be kind of cool. So Old Forester, 1870, George Garvin Brown was a pharmaceutical salesman, and he kept getting complaints from doctors that he worked with that the stuff they were getting just wasn't good from purchase to purchase. At the time, bourbon was generally exclusively a just barrel product. You bought a barrel, and that's what you got. Or in the case of like George, his company would buy the barrel and they would, distribute it to doctors and whatnot. But the quality and consistency was a problem because a lot of the rectifiers at the time that were buying barrels and then reselling them were taking a bit of the things that they, bit of the good whiskey, and then refilling it in best case scenario, water, getting worse, tobacco spit, rusty nails, turpentine. Because basically there were no real standards. If it was brown and had a bite, you called it whiskey. That was generally the way it worked. Gave these doctors lots of inconsistent experience. Their patients were actually getting sicker. So George went to his boss and said, "Hey, I've got this idea how we can fix this." His boss said, "That sounds great, George. I'm not interested. You go do the thing." So George and his team worked on correcting these issues by purchasing batches of bourbon from 3 distilleries around Louisville: Atherton, Mattingly, and Melwood. George and Brown-Forman would later purchase the Mattingly distillery completely. But they created a blend of these whiskeys to ensure a consistent flavor profile, consistent product, and sealed the whiskey in glass bottles to ensure that it couldn't be tampered with before it was consumed. This was the first time that a whiskey was available exclusively in glass bottles. Many other companies would provide you a bottle when you bought the barrel, so you could bottle it yourself. But this was the first time anyone had said, "Nope, we're going to seal it. It's the only way we're going to sell it," because we want to make sure that everyone has a consistent experience. So 1870, Old Forester was founded. Then in 1897, the Bottled in Bond Act creates additional regulations to guarantee safety in distilled whiskey, forcing Old Forester to go from 90 proof to 100 proof to meet the requirements of the Bottled in Bond Act. 1910 was the fire on Whiskey Row, which led to the creation of Old Fine Whiskey, which you see today in our Whiskey Row series of 1910. Prohibition. In 1959 was when we introduced Old Forester 86 proof to appeal to lighter palates. Vodka and clear rum were kings at the time after World War II and through the 50s. 2002 was the first release of Birthday Bourbon. 2014, we started Whiskey Row. And then 2015, really cool moment, Campbell Brown, a 5th generation member of the Brown family, was named the president and managing director at Old Forester, which really kind of gave us a good connection to the past and allowed us to start releasing President's Choice again, because Old Forester got a president. Moving on to what we're really here for. Talking about barrels, their importance in this whole process, they are essential. Brown-Forman owns two cooperages, one outside of Louisville in Kentucky and one in Alabama. The one in Alabama primarily makes barrels for Jack Daniels. The one in Kentucky makes all of your Old Forester, Woodford Reserve, Cooper's Craft, those kinds of things. Because we own the cooperage, we're able to make sure that our barrels are of the quality that we require. Because depending on who you talk to, they're going to tell you the barrel provides anywhere from 40 to 80% of a bourbon's flavor. Never really a fan of that number. It sounds more like, oh yeah, the cable guy will be there somewhere between noon and 6. Just, narrow it down for me. Because nobody really agrees on how much it really does. But having tried some new make, fresh off the still, I would say 60 to 80% of the flavor probably comes from the barrel. Closer to that like 70% range if I were to force to put a number on it. So focusing our attention on the barrel is very important since the whiskey is going to be sitting in there for a while. Type of oak used, obviously the most common is American oak. Minnesota grown oak is actually frequently sought out because of our cool climate. The oak trees grow at a slower rate, apparently, and therefore create a tighter grain, which is more liquid tight for the aging. French oak is also used. I know some distilleries have started experimenting with Hungarian oak and Mizunara oak from Japan, which is really expensive stuff. The other big factor is your cooper, the guy that's making the barrel or gal. Having an experienced cooper makes a big difference because they're the ones picking out the staves that are going into that barrel, making sure everything's tight, done correctly. And it's really cool to watch them do it. Like some of these guys, put together a barrel in 20 seconds, and it's crazy. The toasting and charring process is necessary not only for a legal requirement, but also to create that flavor. The toasting creates that red layer that allows for the whiskey to pull more things from the barrel. The charring creates more of a carbon filter layer that pulls the bad things out of the whiskey. Your barrel entry proof, higher proof, decreases the amount that's extracted from the oak. A lower proof will increase that oak extraction, make that interaction happen a lot more quickly, which if you've tried young whiskeys that are particularly in smaller barrels, put in at a lower barrel proof, they've got good color and they pulled a lot of stuff out of the oak, but they didn't really mellow out or have enough time to mellow out, so they can be very tannic in that particular expression. And then the storage method of where you put your barrels, which is one of the big differences with Old Forester and most other distilleries, we'll get into next. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the concept of the traditional rickhouse, which most distilleries use today. They're typically 8-9 stories tall. Basically, it's a wooden frame that creates the entire support for the building with a tin skirt around it. They're open to the elements and go through aging cycles with the seasons of the year. So there's really no temperature control. And you'll hear people talk about, I did this pick from this place and it was an 8th floor pick. So it got a lot more interaction with the wood because the temperature fluctuated more and the liquid was drawn in and extracted, etc. So that's really what your traditional rickhouses do. And it's very common and very effective. Just takes time. And there's no real way of cheating that, as we all know. What makes Old Forester different, along with Old Forester different, along with like Woodford Reserve and I think Victories as well, does heat cycling. So a heat cycled warehouse gives you a bit of climate control. It's not like you're not heating and air conditioning the whole thing and doing all of that. The warehouses that we use at Old Forester, brick and mortar buildings, most of which have 8 floors. There's a couple that I think have 6. And the cool thing with the warehouses, they're divided into sections of 2 floors. So there's like a concrete floor and then a wood floor, a concrete floor, and a wood floor. So that when the liquid temperature in the barrels in a section drops to a specific point, they won't tell me specifically what that is, somewhere between 65 and 70 degrees, I believe. Then they close up the windows, kick on the heat in that section until the liquid temperature reaches a specific point somewhere between 90 and 100, depending on what they're trying to do. And then they shut it off, let the liquid naturally cool back down. The effect of that really is one of the reasons why Old Forester doesn't put an age statement on a lot of their products. Because of the heat cycling, a bourbon that is aged in one of our warehouses for, say, 4 years is going to have a flavor profile more typical of, say, a 6 to maybe even 6.5 year aged bourbon in a traditional rickhouse. Thereabouts. It's not really a hard and fast rule. So that's why a lot of our stuff doesn't have an age statement on it, because we don't think that accurately reflects the maturation that it's gone through. One of my favorite little bits of information, when the heat cycling process is happening, no one is allowed to spend more than, I think it's like 10 minutes in that section of the warehouse. And they're only allowed in if it's absolutely necessary, because of the amount of alcoholic vapor that would be in that environment, that if they're in there longer than 10 to 12 minutes, they would probably be drunk by the time they left. Which someday I really want to convince them just to let me do it, because I want to experience it. I think it's worth the risk just to say I did it. I don't think that's going to happen. So our heat cycling process runs through September through April, where we begin the season in September, monitoring those sections. And the number of heat cycles that we go through varies year to year, depends a lot on weather conditions and things of that nature. It's really a lot of fun to see. Like some years it's 6 cycles, some years it's 3, some years it's 10. And so that can change a lot of what things you're doing. And the different warehouses develop their own personalities as to how the barrels react to that. It is not really a new process. The LeBron Graham distillery, where Woodford Reserve is now, was set up with a steam-powered heat cycling system approximately like 150 years ago. So it's not a new thing like the places that are doing their pressure cooker bourbons or different things like that. It's a pretty traditional method for a lot of these producers. So the single barrel program, how it all comes together, and why we're here today. I hope everybody was able to get a bottle of one of the picks, either the South Lyndale liquors, which we're not going to talk about the labeling process on that, because I had to double check every email to see that it wasn't my fault for the spelling error. Thankfully it was not, so I didn't get in trouble. Or the 2020 Fixer Elixir, both of which are really, really fun whiskeys. But as they're in the warehouse, the barrels are sampled on a rotating schedule throughout their time. Every barrel has a quote-unquote graduation date. Typically at about 3.5 years, the warehouse team will sample each of the barrels and decide like what its destiny is. Is it going to become part of a birthday bourbon release? Is it going to be President's Choice? Regular old 86 proof? Is it going into Whiskey Row, going to the Statesman? Or if it's got some truly unique characteristics, truly remarkable, will it become part of the single barrel program? And it's a way for us to highlight the diversity of Old Forester. Every bourbon that Old Forester makes uses the exact same mash bill. It's all 72% corn, 18% rye, 10% malted barley. And our proprietary yeast strain that I think maybe right now I think they can trace it back to just after World War II. But it's all the same mash bill. So the only variations, whether we're talking a single barrel, whether we're talking 100, just signature 100 proof, or we're talking Old Forester 1920, it's all the same recipe. The only variations are coming from where the barrel sits, in which warehouse, and how many heat cycles it goes through, how long, and the amount of time that it ages. And some of you may remember until before May of 2020, all of the Old Forester barrel selections were bottled at 90 proof. Didn't matter what you liked them at, didn't matter what the samples were that came to you, they were all 90 proof. This was an homage to George Garvin Brown's original product. He always felt that his bourbon tasted best at 90 proof. So why did we change? Two big reasons. One, consumer demand, and a little bit of showing off. People were consistently asking for barrel strength Old Forester. With the popularity of Old Forester 1920, Prohibition style being our highest proof release up to that point, we felt that it was time to meet those demands from our fans. And also we wanted to show off how fun and diverse just pure unfiltered Old Forester can be. The single barrel strength offerings that we do are very, very minimally filtered. I mean, they're essentially poured through a strainer to make sure no chunks get in the bottle, and that's basically it. We do also offer the barrel selections at 100 proof. Most of those are picked by bars and restaurants, just so that way they have a consistent proof point for any cocktail program or whatever. It's a little harder to create a cocktail around a barrel strength offering. And how it's chosen. So how these got here. So all the Old Forester single barrels chosen in one of three ways. If a store just wants a single barrel and they just want it as quickly as they can possibly get it, they can have our master taster, Jackie Zeiken, make the selection. You tell them like, oh, I want one with lots of honey notes, and they'll try to find you a barrel and off they'll go. The most common one is an account will request samples. The distillery will send samples from 3 different barrels, and then a local representative, me, will take them to the store and, okay, we're going to make this pick and do all that selection. Our favorite one, which we haven't been able to do due to COVID-19, is taking folks down to the distillery and making the selection there. It's a lot more fun. It's a great opportunity to get people to Louisville because you like whiskey. Who doesn't want to go hang out in Louisville for a weekend? And then once the selection's made, the barrel's finalized in our system, getting ready for bottling and labeling. We're not going to talk about the labels on this one. This, again, wasn't my fault. So there are 2 unique bottles that we've got. The South Lyndale Liquors and the 2020 Fixer Elixir. Both of these bottles come from floor 6 of Warehouse H, which I find interesting because I think they have pretty unique flavor profiles for being effectively right next to each other for 4 years. Distilled on the same date. And, as you're trying it, don't hesitate to add ice or water. Just because it's barrel strength doesn't mean you can't drink it any other way. The right way to enjoy whiskey is however you want it to. You want to. And I really like with the barrel proofs. I've enjoyed going side by side against my bottle of 1920, just because showing, even if it's only 10 points apart, it's still a dramatic difference and a lot of fun for me. So yeah, if you got tasting notes, I mean, feel free to unmute yourselves, ask questions. Like, I am perfectly fine answering whatever you got. I love questions, and don't worry, I'm not afraid to say I don't know.
I got one.
Sure.
I got one. So I've always wondered the Old Forester store picks were priced too high for what they are.
Okay.
And let me tell you why I think and why.
Sure.
So basically, a single barrel, even at 90 proof, was similar to Signature 100 in terms of age, and that's around between $20 and $30, but the single barrel is over $40 or $50 in some cases now.
Sure.
And comparing that to like a Buffalo Trace standard and Buffalo Trace single barrel, or Eagle Rare standard, Eagle Rare single barrel, or even Russell's Reserve standard and Russell's Reserve, they were all same proof single barrel versions of their respective brands, whatever, and they were all priced similarly. So I've always wondered why is there this discrepancy in the Old Forester only?
Sure. And that's a really good question. I don't know the complete answer to it, honestly, because I'm a very, very small cog in a very, very large machine. I would guess that part of that, like, I know with like the pricing differences now with the barrel strength is largely due to the fact that it's a barrel strength.
Correct. That's understandable.
Which is a whole different thing.
That's why I asked.
Not really what you're asking. With the 90 proof, I don't know. I found it frustrating myself in seeking out the 90 proof, because I'm like, I get it. If it's $40, okay, I'll pay a $10 premium. Like, all right, I don't really like it, but I get it. But some of them on IT, it was like 50, getting up to like $50, and I was just like, I'm sure it's good, because I would, even before I started this job, I was always a fan of Old Forester, and like, I'm sure it's good, but I don't know if it's worth $20 more than what I'm going to walk out the door with on something that I can drink every day with Signature 100 proof. So I'm not sure what I'm sure they can justify it with like additional processing or whatever in the, but honestly, I don't know. I can try to find out for you though. They're not going to tell me, but I'll try.
I'm sure they have heard this before.
Anyone else got any other questions or notes on the whiskeys? Which, if anybody has both of the bottles, like which one, I'd love to hear like which one you like better, which one you prefer.
There are some single barrels that I've enjoyed that are available in the cities. I try to buy them every once in a while because they're still sitting in stores. Barrel strengths are something else that they're fun.
Barrel strength are a really good time.
I don't have both of the single barrels, but I am drinking the South Lyndale version next to the 1920.
Nice.
And the South Lyndale is remarkably more concentrated color and a bit more of a reserved and tight profile. It's interesting.
Yeah.
So
I'm doing the same thing as well. I love putting 1920 next to the barrel pits. It's good fun. Good fun.
Hey Todd, can you hear me?
Yep.
Thanks for doing this and setting it up, and also I'm very, very loyal to 1920, so it was hard when I was drinking this to concede that I liked it more, which was hard. in the tasting with staff or with other folks that are helping you pick out, because you may get an array of single barrels that you could go through. Like,
Sure.
what's that discussion like? And tell me about that fun.
Oh, it's honestly, because before I started working for Old Forester, I was manager and buyer at a liquor store here in Minneapolis. And I can honestly say I am so glad to be on this side of the table for all of these picks now, because I don't have to make the choice as to which one, because I've yet to have one that wasn't good. Like there's just no wrong decisions. Actually, I take it back. There was one that was just kind of like, okay. I don't know how this one snuck in. But that conversation, like the interesting part is what we do is however many people we can usually, with the samples I send, we can usually have anywhere from 4 to 6 people involved in doing the selection. But what we'll do is we'll recommend that they taste everything neat, then they add a couple drops of water, and then they completely over dilute it, just drown it. Because the quality assurance folks, like when they'll get it down to 20% ABV, just because once you get that low, any flaws just jump right out at you. There's nothing to hide behind. It's, similar to like if a not great brewery makes a bad Pilsner, there's no flavor profile for them to hide behind. You just know it's bad. But what we'll do is when we're discussing it, we'll ask everybody, do you have one that's just straight up no? Just a flat out, this is not, of the 3 samples, is there one that you're like, no, this isn't it? And most of the time, I'd say about 80% of the time, that one, A, B, or C, is usually consistent for folks. Like they're like, oh yeah, it's B. B's the one that's just out. And then, we'll talk through like, okay, well, these 3 people, have them write down like 1, 2, and 3, what their picks are, so they don't have to argue about it just yet. Because we can make this last like an hour, just because we want to make sure they're happy with the barrel that they're getting. And it's weird. Like sometimes it'll end up like 3 of the people will have a number 1 pick, and the other 2 will have a different number 1 pick, but they all have the same barrel listed at number 2. And so then, they'll dilute it a little more, or think about like, well, how's that? If people, for our customers, are they going to drink it neat? Are they going to drink it on the rocks? What are they going to do? Which one? And mostly it's just talking them through what their customers would want. Because there have been some that I've been fortunate enough to try that's like, wow, that is just out there. That is one of the most unique samples I have ever tasted. That's crazy. And then you think about it and you're like, yeah, but I don't really think people are gonna like it's more of a niche thing that are gonna like that craziness. So you let them talk it through and keep tasting it, and then by the time everybody works through their samples, they've got a slight buzz going on because they're drinking barrel strength whiskey. So it's like, yeah, let's go with A, and it's fine. It's great. We'll work through it. But they are really fun conversations. Sorry, go ahead.
And do you find it's because tends to be slightly more niche as well? I mean, as probably the nerds on this call will attend to, but like there is that's interesting. Like with the single barrels, like the like the 90 proofs, you can fly those off the shelf because they're just the profile is so good, and it's an easy proof point to. But they're small. You're gonna have probably a smaller batch, and that high proof is all us nerds.
That is true. And in fairness, I'm one of those nerds as well, and you guys are my bread and butter. So let's keep this going. I love all that stuff. But yeah, it is. I mean, because especially with the low yield to a barrel strength release. Like most of these releases, I mean, they're selling out in a day or two in most cases, you know, and it's, if not, like I've, you know, there've been a couple that have sold out in less than a day. And it can be frustrating because, you know, everybody wants it, but there's only so much to go around. And I tend to be a bit like Andy Dufresne in Shawshank Redemption. When I talk with our single barrel coordinator, I'm like, hey, are there any extra allocations in other states that nobody's using that we can have in Minnesota? And, you know, 99 times out of 100, the answer is no. But I keep asking. And the one time she said yes, I was like, sweet. And then I asked, you know, twice a month. Because again, I learned from Andy, like, oh yeah, they came through and sent me money and a bunch of books, and I'm going to write 2 letters. Hey, it works. But yeah, it's difficult because all of it's, you know, highly allocated as to how many we get in the state of Minnesota. And I mean, you know, the funniest part for me with the single barrel selection process is one of the first ones I did was for the store that I used to work at. And we had been on the waiting list for so long that I was the person that had requested to be put into the single barrel program. So when I sent in the final form, they called me up and like, this is right. You're not supposed to sign this one. I said, well, I didn't. Not in the way you're thinking anyway. Like I did when I was there, but now I'm here and the one, and so they got a good laugh out of that. But it's a long process. And I mean, as you guys know, bourbon, I mean, whiskey in general, bourbon specifically, is just exploding. And when you've got to wait, you know, 4 to 10, 12, 15 years for your product to be ready to go, you know, you're going to run into some supply speed bumps.
I have a follow-up question to the barrel selection.
Sure.
So what happens if your store, group, whatever, and your tasting people really was not impressed with any of the samples?
Well, I haven't had that happen yet. I know in the past when that has been the case, like if it's one of the reasons why we like the distillery visit method, because then it's okay, they just go and pull another barrel and boom,
Right.
good.
Right.
With the in-market samples, it gets a little more complicated. Generally, what I think we would do in that case is look at like, okay, well, who gets to make a selection next month, and then call them up and say, hey, do you want to do one for this month? Because we've got a little, you know, whatever. And then just swap them for that to get some other samples.
So you still try to accommodate that store?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's, you know, it's a relationship business like anything else. Like we want to keep them happy, you know, like it's, I would love to be able to do single barrels for everybody whenever they want it. Like it would be awesome.
Right.
Especially because I get to go in and buy them and put them on the company card. Like it's wonderful for me. But it is a scenario I'm not looking forward to, because I'm sure it'll happen at some point where they'll be like, oh, I mean, they're good, but nothing really jumps out, or we don't feel like it really, because a lot of stores, particularly stores that do a lot of single barrels, and I mean, you guys know this just as well as I do, like you get to know, like stores have certain palettes, they have certain history of the things that they pick. I mean, they're building a name on their store picks. So, you know, if I go to South Lyndale and buy a barrel pick, it's going to be good because they know what they're doing. And that's, you know, if I go to this place or that place or whatever, like, you know, who knows what they're doing. And so if they get something that they're like, I just don't think our customers are really going to jive with this, we don't want to do that, then we're going to try to accommodate them as best we can. just their relationship's important.
Yep. Thank
What's the yield on a barrel that goes through the heat cycle process? How many bottles do you get for something like the two that we're tasting tonight?
Like on these two, I mean, what we're seeing is typically anywhere from like 124 to 140 bottles ish. And a lot of that, there've been, thankfully it didn't happen here, but I had a friend that did one in somewhere in Illinois, and it was really bad because between the time they pulled the samples and the time they went to grab the barrel to bottle it, they had missed a leak in the barrel. So when it went to bottling, they ended up getting like 20 bottles out of the barrel. And, so of course they just sent it to them anyway. And we're like, we're going to get you another one, like we understand but there's nothing we could do, whatever. But it was just like, I'd never heard of one being that low. I mean, there've been plenty of barrels where, not in the single barrel program, but just in warehouse work where they'll find one that's just completely empty. It leaked. But yeah, so typically, I mean, about 124 is what I'm seeing for most of them.
If you have both in front of you, could you share some of the differences between the
Sure.
Elixir and the South Lyndale?
Yeah, well, I guess since we got the time, I will talk about the labeling on the South Lyndale. None of us noticed the spelling error until it popped up on somebody's Instagram account, like the day after they got released. Which was funny because like I had looked at the picture on it and just scrolling on Instagram, and my brain like corrected it, so I didn't notice it all. Then I got the phone call, and we all go into, oh crap, and so we get on the phone to the folks at the distillery, and like we're going to send out new labels and replace them. And I'm talking with Amanda at South Lyndale, like we're going to fix this. We got new labels coming, and thanks, but there's no point. Everything's gone already. Like it's already sold. Like it doesn't matter.
Isn't the oddity kind of just, in itself awesome? You know what I mean? To have that, to even just to say like it's misspelled, to have, I don't know. I think that's in itself kind of cool because it's its own little story or whatever, right?
And I joked, I'm like, well, that'll just make them worth twice as much on secondary.
100%, 100%.
It's the upside down airplane stamp.
Yeah, exactly. And see, this is why, like with both of these, I really liked them both. I was really surprised, just because, like, the South Lyndale liquors, to me, like, it comes off a little bit more like caramely and fruity, and on the Fixer Elixir, I get a touch more burn on the nose, but not much. And then just a lot more vanilla. And it just, because like looking, let me pull up my notes because I got the barrel numbers here somewhere. Because yeah, they were, the two barrels were like on the same floor, the same warehouse, and like 12 slots apart. I mean, so for all intents and purposes, they were practically right next to each other. And just that they age differently, like it's so much fun for me to see like how much that is just kind of a crapshoot of you put it in a barrel and just hope everything works out, it's a great time. I really like them both. I have to say I probably like the Fixer Elixir a little better. I can't really put my finger on why. But I'm not going to turn either one of them down if anybody offers to pour me one. So, what's everybody else's favorite of the two? or just favorite Old Forester in general. Like I'm cool with that too. I have no problem with the feelings of job.
Hey, I've got a question about Old Forester just in general, and this is more so like, so, and this goes for other brands too. Like I see Bell Mead as well. It's like, you know, when you have Old Forester and you have like 4 or 5 different bottles, like sitting on a shelf, right? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not talking about barrel picks or store picks. I'm not talking about Prohibition. Like, how does Old Forester, just from a marketing standpoint, sell the different bottles outside of just proofs? And like, you get where I'm coming from? Like, how do you sell different products to a customer base when they see the options there? I don't know. I'm in that background, and that's always just interesting.
Sure.
So.
Well, I mean, are you talking like, you know, 86 proof versus 100 proof, or are we talking like 100 proof signature versus the bottled and bond 1897?
Yeah, I'm almost like both here too, where you can just see a slate of products, and then you can actually, you know, any person can sit there and say, well, this at this proof, this is why we actually picked this. I'm asking just like, you see a palette of bottles basically, you know, on a shelf, and how does Old Forester use those different offerings to sell their whole line? Does that make sense? Like when you look at their labeling across the board, and it's very similar too. You know,
Sure. Honestly, the biggest way we do it is been the most challenging part of this year. It's through tastings, sampling events, in-store seminars, things like that. Like that's basically getting people to try it. And I know that might sound a little bit like a cop-out, but it is a very important thing, just because we'll take the example of like signature 100 proof, you know, everyday bourbon on the shelf under $30. It's a solid bourbon. It's just bourbon flavored bourbon. That's what it tastes like. And then you have also at 100 proof in the Whiskey Row series, the Old Forester 1897 bottled and bond, which is, you know, $15 to $20 more expensive. You know, they're both 100 proof, so what the heck? And like, yeah, I can tell people the story about why we did the bottled and bond and the difference between the two. And I think those two whiskeys are vastly different. I get so many more layers of flavor on the bottled and bond than I do on the signature, which, don't get me wrong, signature is my go-to. It's the one that I find myself purchasing with my own money because I drank my entire sample bottle. So I can't, since I'm not allowed to do samplings right now, I can't really be like, oh, I need another sample bottle. What do you mean you need another sample bottle? You're not doing samplings. No one wants to talk to you because of COVID. So how do you need another sample bottle? Whole different conversation. But yeah, pitching people that in, and for a lot of them, it's the history behind the brand tends to sell it a lot. But the biggest thing, again, and I don't want to sound like I'm copping out, it's getting people to try it. Mm-hmm. It's I mean, because like folks that don't know, like you can look at a line of 6 different bourbons that are all at say 92 to 94 proof, and you know, an experienced bourbon drinker like all of us, you know, we're going to know that like those are probably going to be really different because they're going to have different mash bills or different aged in different barrels or different lengths of time in a barrel, whatever. We're going to know that, but folks that are asking a lot of questions of like, what bourbon should I buy? They're not going to have that experience to know that like, well, just because they're the same proof point doesn't mean they taste the same, or just because they're the same mash bill doesn't mean they taste the same. They went into different barrels, they aged in different warehouses. I can tend to go on rants about that quite a bit with folks. But yeah, it's really, because one of the things that I love doing the most that I haven't had the opportunity, because I started in this job in February. So got through a month of training. They're like, hey, we've got you set up for all these events and we're going to these tastings. And then the world shut down.
Yeah.
And So it was really, really tough that I wasn't able to like get out there and do that, because that is the best way, just to, when even having conversations like this, like that's why we like doing these things, because you already have the single barrel or some other old Forester sitting at home, and we can talk about it. And I don't have to worry like, oh, well, it's illegal for me to ship people samples, and you know, whatever liquor laws, and you know, it's Minnesota, so let's make things as difficult as possible.
No, I completely agree with you. And like, you know, the funny thing too is like, I think that we've got a lot of experts on here. I'm someone who I would call a longtime whiskey drinker that was born into starting to collect and get way more into it in my quarantine time. I think, yeah, we'll move with that. People here. So I do appreciate that perspective. I got to ask you the question that everyone's going to probably like tell me I can never come on one of these to ask again. If you got to go outside of Old Forester, what's your go-to?
Oh, I mean, it's a really tough question, because if I'm being 100% honest, like my favorite whiskey category is pot still Irish whiskey.
Okay.
So like Redbreast, Green Spot, like that's my heritage is Irish and Scottish, so that's really just where my soul sings. If I had to go outside of Old Forester in a bourbon, I would probably have to go. I mean, I'm a big fan of Eagle Rare. I really, I mean, when it sucks to say this, but when you can find it, you know,
Buy it.
yeah, it's like it's delicious. I mean, I love the E.H. Taylors. I mean, I'm a big fan of most of what Buffalo Trace does. There's tons of, I mean, Wild Turkey 101. That's just fine for me.
Great bottle. Yeah.
You know, like and like, I get it. Like, oh yeah, for the price, you know, it's wonderful. But like, there's stuff that like, I mean, Evan Williams bottled and bond, like, it's not cheap because it's bad. It's cheap because they've been doing it forever, you know? And like, there's stuff that may not be my favorite, but hey, I'll keep a bottle on hand for, you know, cocktails or
I always tell people Evan Williams single barrel I think is delicious.
Oh,
and it's a sub 30 bottle and it's amazing. I really appreciate you doing this, by the way. I just wanted to say that. Like, I look forward to this all week, and thank you for South Lyndale to throw this on. Sorry for, you know, kind of nerding out here, but I'm really enjoying my time.
That's why we do this stuff. Like, it's. I mean, if we didn't have an outlet for our nerd things, you know, I mean,
Absolutely.
It's the little stuff that's going to get us through the rest of this crap. Because, you know, I mean, in an ideal world, we would have all been doing bottle shares and whatnot throughout the holiday season and planning spring get-togethers and whatever, and can't. But this is all we can do.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Kind of circling back to the single barrel program, do you find different profiles between, let's say, states? You find one profile Minneapolis likes and one profile, let's say, Madison or Milwaukee likes?
Interesting. That's a really interesting question. At this point, no. I have not, just because I don't feel like I have enough data to make that kind of call. It would not surprise me if there ended up being something like that, because, you know, I mean, you just look at like, oh, Minnesota's, you know, the number one state for X liquor brand, and Wisconsin's the number one state for X liquor. Right next to each other. How is it that different? Like, why is some flavored vodka the favorite thing in Minnesota and some flavored brandy is the favorite thing in Wisconsin? So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if there were different profiles. I just don't think I have enough information to go on at this point.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to, you know, see what that looks like. And selfishly, I have friends in Madison, Milwaukee, and I could definitely help them. It's going to be, you know, different.
Sure. Sorry for the non-answer, but
Did Old Forester have to move product around in the single barrel program with restaurants going through the year they've had? I've seen it retail, some other restaurant branded picks, not
Yeah.
the brand, but it's just curious, like, it's been such a crazy year, what happens?
Yeah, there have been some pretty, sad losses. I mean, like just locally here, Butcher and Boar shutting down. I mean, that one hurt a lot for a lot of us. I mean, there are so many of these bars that, I mean, as a rep of like, okay, well, that was a guy that I could call up and be like, hey, can you do me a favor and, put a feature on for this, and I'll, get you later or whatever. And it's really been challenging, I think, and sad to see restaurants go. But then you're like, okay, well, we still got 40 cases of this 90 proof Old Forester barrel pick sitting in the warehouse that this place clearly isn't going to use anymore because they don't exist. And so then we had to find, retailers that would take that on. And it's usually pretty easy because even with the popularity of single barrels at this point, it's not that hard to move them. Because, people, a lot of people like us, you kind of, you'd love to find a bottle of Pappy or Weller or, whatever. It'd be great if I can walk into it. But also, like, I know that that's probably not going to happen. But I walk into a store and like, oh, you got a barrel pick. Well, that sounds cool. At least I'm not leaving here with nothing. So it, becomes more of a fun thing.
Do you think that, like, I completely agree with you, and sorry for jumping in here. I completely agree where it's like, yeah, I mean, it'd be great to walk into one of those extremely rare and allocated bottles. And, I think it's more fun though to see the store picks because, it's somewhat of a connection to the store, just like you talked about. Each store has their own taste. Do you see that being like a big point for Old Forester or for distillery moving forward post-pandemic, that this is a huge part of buying habits compared to where? Sorry for the nerdy questions, guys. I come from this weird background. I'm asking some really specific nerdy ass questions, but that's what kind of makes my mind tick. So,
You're good. I love the nerdy question. I do. I honestly believe that, like, in a lot of cases, single barrel store picks are really going to become right up there with the rest of the unicorn bottles.
Yeah.
They're going to be something that, like, because I mean, if I walk into a store and they're like, oh, I've got a bottle of Old Weller Antique and it's at a reasonable price, then sure, I'll buy it. But if they don't have, something like that I'd be interested in, like, I'm going to see, like, well, what do you have for store picks? What do you have? Like, show me something that I'm not going to get anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the really cool thing about the single barrels. And you're seeing a lot of, like, craft distilleries kind of making their mark with that as well. It's part of also what revitalized the whole bottled and bond. It was a way for smaller distilleries to show people that, like, no, there's a quality aged product in this bottle. Because, for so long it was like, okay, this is extremely young green whiskey that you just charged me $60 for, and I'm a little pissed. Love supporting local, but I feel kind of hurt, So yeah, I think single barrels are really going to be the big thing for the next couple of years, at least. Probably the next 5 years would be my guess.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
What are consumer tastings like at the distillery in Louisville?
Well, I have only been to them as a consumer, actually. I visited the distillery once before I got this job, just because I love Old Forester, and the tastings They're different for like the end of the tour tasting, which is a lot of fun. The folks there are phenomenally well informed on the products. And if anybody gets a chance to, the distillery is not open for tours right now, but when it is, I highly recommend it, because the Whiskey Row distillery for Old Forester, they also have a mini cooperage on site. So you get to see them raise a barrel and char the barrel. Like when we were there, my girlfriend got to be the one that pushed the button to start the fire, which made her extremely happy. But with the barrel picks, there's a barrel room in the Whiskey Row distillery, which I think can hold like 900 barrels. We're really interested to see what that's going to end up tasting like, because it's different conditions than any of the other warehouses. So, because it's completely climate controlled, because it's part of the tour. But there's a like floating platform in the middle of this barrel room that has a big conference table with, like barrel stave chairs, and it's gorgeous. And that's where you do your single barrel selection at the distillery, just in the middle of this room. They will roll the barrels out. Whether they're the actual barrels that the samples came from, who cares? It's great theater, So yeah, it's a cool process. I tried to incorporate more pictures of the actual warehouse, but it seems that fumes from aging barrels and things doesn't go well with cameras, and sparks and little electronic things. So they're like, no, we don't have anything for you. But sorry for the ramble, but there we are.
Sorry, Todd, just a random question. My OCD was wondering, the poster that you have behind you, what's the furthest bottle that we can't see on camera, I guess?
Is that birthday?
Well,
The other side
poster
of
behind me is it's one of our pop-up banners that we use at like whiskey festivals to set next to the table and whatnot, and I just use it here simply because it covers the mess that my home office is, so you can't see the mess behind there, and it has the one.
Yeah, sorry, what's the last bottle? It's like the 86, the 1920, 1897, 1870.
1870.
Is there another bottle?
Then, so we've got 1870, 1897, 1920, 86 100 proof, the old single barrel label, Statesman, and then birthday.
Okay. So I assume there was another bottle behind the 1870.
There is not.
4x4. The OCD in me is
Yeah.
a little crazy that it's off-centered to some degree.
Yeah.
But, okay, I was just curious. Thanks.
And I think they just did that so they could squeeze in the birthday bourbon.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks. And again, to replay Andrew's comment, thank you for doing this.
Oh, yeah. Thank you guys for coming. Like, this has been awesome. Looks like another question in the chat from Matt. Like, can you speak to when the barrel strength rye store picks will start to hit shelves? Saw label a while back. Oh, yes. I neglected to anticipate that you would be like me and checking the TTB filings and all that fun stuff. Unfortunately, I cannot speak to that, mostly because I don't know. I would say, I mean, all I'm really allowed to say at this point is it will be sometime in 2021. They have not given us, because again, like, here's me and then everyone else at Old Forester up here, like, as far as getting any marketing or release knowledge. Like, half the time stuff's already in the warehouse, but we're like, hey guys, we're releasing a new product. Okay, would have been good to know a couple weeks ago so I could have learned about it. So unfortunately, no, I don't know when the rye store picks the barrel strength rye will start to hit the shelves. I know the labels have been approved, but I have no further information for you, unfortunately. Because believe me, if I knew, I would tell you, because I'm really excited about barrel strength rye because I love Old Forester rye. It's amazing. Just because I'm really not a rye fan in general. It's most of the like 95% ryes are a little too spicy for me personally, which is why I think I like Old Forester rye. It's not bad.
Can you share if South Lyndale ordered a barrel?
What's that?
Can you share if South Lyndale ordered a barrel of the rye?
Oh, wow. Well, because since we don't have any release information, we don't have any allocation numbers either. So we have no idea how it's going to hit or how it's going to be, if it's going to just be an everyday product of barrel strength on the shelf, or if it's going to become a store pick release. Like I know nothing other than what's on the label on the TTB website. Like that was legit the email that the vice president of Old Forester sent out to all of us. Like, here's all you can talk about. And it was a JPEG of the label. Like,
But that label is not approved yet, right? So
it is approved.
Oh, it is approved.
It is approved. Yep. Both there, yeah. The barrel strength rye is approved, I believe. And it's one of the things that I love about working for Old Forester is that they're not afraid to put new things out there. It's been like before the Whiskey Row series, like it was just 86 and 100 proof for years. And they did Birthday in 2002, and then Whiskey Row came out, and they're like, wow, people are really responding to this. And it's awesome. It's a great company to work for.
I listen to a lot of bourbon podcasts, and they always, this is my bourbon is my favorite one, by the way. If anyone, listens to bourbon and you want to take your dog or if you somehow take your cat for a walk, which is impossible, but you want to do that, you can take your cat for a walk. This is my bourbon talks so highly of Old Forester, one of the brands I kind of got into when I was, listening to them, but they go over all the different ones too. So it's kind of cool to hear about them going through all these different brands and doing that. And like, I don't know, the whole thing is a community, like you said, it's relationship business. That's always kind of the fun thing to hear, because they're in tune with with what's going on, but at the same time, they're interested in hearing what is coming up next.
Yeah, and I can't thank all of you guys enough for being here and for, just being bourbon nerds in general, supporting Old Forester specifically. But we couldn't do what we do without fans in the world. Like, there have been very dark times in our nation's history when bourbon wasn't popular and when distilleries were barely keeping the lights on. But we're lucky enough to live in a time where there's this amazing bourbon boom happening and lots of cool stuff. And for me personally, being in this job, like, it's because of you guys. Like, that's why I love doing this, because I like going to festivals, whether it's like Whiskey on Ice or just going to and doing a seminar in a store, just doing a tasting, getting to talk to people that love bourbon and love whiskey in general. Like, it's so much fun, because Brown-Forman has some pretty amazing scotches and Irish whiskey. Well, just throwing that out there. If anybody's a Scotch fan and you can find yourself a bottle of the Ben Rioch Smoky 12, buy it. Goes great with smoked ribs. Does anyone have any other questions, comments, concerns? All right. Well, at that point, I will say goodnight to all of you. Have a wonderful evening and enjoy sipping on some Old Forester Single Barrel. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate you guys being here. It was a great time. Love the questions. Makes me very, very happy.
Todd, thanks so much. Really appreciate you.
Todd.
Seriously. Thank you.
Thank
Have
you.
a great night, and hope to
Look,
see you
it's-
like in the real world soon, where we can actually all share a dram of something and just.
Oh, we're gonna get messed up together, Todd. Don't worry.
Sounds good to me. All right, thank you guys. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks on YouTube. Stay safe. Bye.